As the war in Ukraine edges toward a fifth year after February 2026, Washington's latest push for a peace deal has collapsed, leaving global tensions sharper than ever. In early December 2025, a high-stakes meeting in the Kremlin between Vladimir Putin and U.S. peace envoy Witkoff ended in failure, despite a proposal widely criticized as overly generous to Moscow. But why did the Kremlin reject a deal seemingly shaped in its favor? And what does this breakdown tell us about the deeply conflicting ambitions driving Putin and President Trump? Across Europe, fears of a widening confrontation are accelerating rearmament, from Germany's partial return to conscription to France's new volunteer service launching in 2026. Meanwhile, Russia intensifies drone incursions and hybrid pressure across the continent, warning that Europe, not Moscow, is sabotaging peace. Even in Asia, the ripple effects are visible as China and Russia tighten strategic coordination after Japan's recent security debate. Today, we'll unpack the forces behind this failed peace effort and the rising geopolitical storm it leaves behind. As 2025 drew to a close, the world watched with cautious hope when the Trump administration dispatched its special peace envoy, Witkoff, to Moscow. The early December meeting with Vladimir Putin was billed as the make-or-break moment of Washington's diplomatic push. Yet the talks ended with no progress, no roadmap, no compromise, no shared understanding of what peace might actually look like. On the surface, this collapse looked puzzling. After all, the proposal the U.S. carried into the Kremlin was widely criticized in Europe for leaning heavily toward Russia's preferences, including a plan that would have transferred roughly 20% of Ukraine's Donetsk region, territory Kyiv is still fighting fiercely to protect, to Moscow's control. But the truth is that the failure of the talks had little to do with specific clauses or territorial formulas. It was the predictable outcome of two leaders, Trump and Putin, whose worldviews only appear aligned on the surface. Their objectives, timelines, and strategic instincts are fundamentally incompatible. What Washington's negotiators saw as a bold diplomatic shortcut, the Kremlin viewed as a premature attempt to freeze a conflict at a moment when Russia believes it enjoys battlefield momentum. Putin's closest advisor, Yuri Ushakov, said after the meeting that there were some points we can agree on, and some we cannot. This was diplomatic theater. Everyone in Moscow understands the core sticking point. Russia demands recognition of the territorial gains it currently occupies, while Ukraine, backed by its constitution and supported by British, French, and German leaders, cannot legally or politically concede them. But the deeper story lies in the psychology of both leaders. Trump approached the negotiations like a seasoned businessman used to closing real estate deals, by offering concessions he believed would create a mutually beneficial outcome and by assuming the other side could be persuaded with the right combination of incentives and pressure. For Trump, the prize was a diplomatic trophy, ending the largest interstate war since World War II and claiming the role of peacemaker in the final year of his term. To him, the geopolitical implications were secondary. Whether the proposed settlement undermined Ukraine's sovereignty or reshaped Europe's security architecture was not a factor that weighed heavily in Washington's calculations. Putin, however, plays a different game entirely. His strategic horizon is not measured in election cycles but in decades. Under Russia's revised constitution, he can remain in power until 2036 if he chooses. That gives him the luxury of patience and the ability to pursue long-term geopolitical revisionism without democratic pressure. Unlike Trump, Putin is not looking for a quick resolution. He is seeking historical vindication. The war in Ukraine is not, in his mind, a border dispute or a bargaining chip. It is the third act of a long campaign to reverse what he sees as the humiliation of the Soviet collapse, Act I in Georgia in 2008, Act II in Crimea and Donbass in 2014, and Act III beginning with the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Trump's negotiators underestimated how firmly this worldview shapes every decision in the Kremlin. Putin is convinced that time favors Russia. He believes the battlefield dynamics will eventually break Ukraine's military resilience, especially if U.S. support becomes inconsistent. He also believes that prolonged war fuels his domestic narrative, that Russia is locked in a civilizational struggle against American dominance and Western liberalism. In this sense, anti-Americanism is not just a talking point, it is one of the ideological pillars of his regime. This is why Putin currently sees no advantage in pausing the war. Any ceasefire negotiated under U.S. supervision risks freezing the lines before Russia has achieved what he considers acceptable gains. Worse, it would give Trump, whom Putin regards as unpredictable but politically temporary, a chance to claim credit for shaping a European order that may not benefit Russia after the U.S. election cycle resets. From Moscow's perspective, appearing cooperative while quietly prolonging the conflict is the optimal strategy. Pretend to negotiate, reject key proposals, maintain battlefield pressure, and let the opposing side exhaust itself. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly welcomed U.S. mediation in front of the cameras, but this politeness masks deep frustration. His government cannot accept a plan that violates Ukraine's constitution, abandons civilians under occupation, and rewards aggression. And European leaders share this view. Britain, France, and Germany immediately supported Kyiv's position, not only out of solidarity but because they fear that any peace built on forced concessions would invite further Russian adventurism in Eastern Europe. While Washington's failed December 2025 peace push exposed the widening gap between Trump and Putin, Europe drew a very different conclusion from the diplomatic fallout. The United States can no longer be counted on as a reliable security pillar. That sentiment, once whispered in policy circles, has now burst into the open. Britain, France, and Germany, all longtime anchors of NATO, have rejected Trump's Russia-leaning peace proposal and publicly reaffirmed Ukraine's position. More importantly, these governments have quietly begun preparing for a scenario unthinkable just a few years ago, confronting a militarized, emboldened Russia without guaranteed American protection. The shift is dramatic, and it is accelerating. Germany, long reluctant to expand its military role, revived a partial form of conscription for the first time in decades. The move signals Berlin's recognition that Europe is entering a multi-year period of volatility. France has followed with its own initiative, a new volunteer-based national service system set to launch in summer 2026, aimed at rebuilding a generation of young citizens capable of supporting national defense. And these are not symbolic gestures. In late 2025, Germany activated the Arrow 3 ballistic missile interceptor system, purchased from Israel, as part of a broader European Sky Shield initiative. For the first time, a coordinated, continent-wide missile defense network, designed specifically with the Russian threat in mind, is moving from discussion to deployment. Europe's rearmament is not a reaction to hypothetical threats. It stems from a cold-eyed assessment of Russia's behavior on the battlefield and beyond. Even as Moscow engages in peace negotiations with the U.S., its military has expanded drone incursions into European airspace. These unmanned flights, documented not only over Eastern Europe but also approaching Western European regions, serve multiple purposes: testing NATO's detection systems, signaling Russia's ability to project pressure, and nurturing psychological fatigue among European populations. Many European intelligence services now argue that a hybrid war is already underway, long before any tanks cross borders. Within Europe, a particularly sharp concern has grown around Russia's potential attack on the Baltic states once its war machine is rebuilt. Given the Kremlin's long-term ambitions and recent statements, these fears are not paranoia. They are rooted in the same strategic logic that drove Moscow into Georgia, Crimea, Donbass, and finally Ukraine. The Kremlin's military doctrine has never hidden its desire to keep a buffer zone preventing what it views as Western encroachment. If Ukraine falls or is coerced into a frozen conflict, the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania are next on the risk map. Putin himself has intensified the rhetoric. Just before the U.S. Russia peace talks in early December 2025, he issued one of his strongest warnings to date. Europe, he claimed, was sabotaging Trump's diplomatic efforts and choosing the path of war. He threatened that if Europe suddenly starts a war with Russia, Moscow's reaction would be decisive and rapid. The statement was calculated, not only to sow fear but to subtly reframe Russia as a defensive actor responding to Western aggression. This narrative plays well domestically and is increasingly broadcast through Russian media channels targeting European audiences. Yet in practice, the war posture is coming from Moscow. Russian forces remain confident, believing they hold tactical advantages on the battlefield. And while Trump's administration signaled that Ukraine's refusal to accept the U.S. peace plan could lead to cuts in intelligence sharing and limitations on European purchases of U.S. weapons, European governments are no longer willing to let their national security depend on American political cycles. That shift is arguably one of the most important geopolitical consequences of 2025, a slow but unmistakable strategic decoupling between Europe and the United States. Inside Ukraine, this geopolitical recalibration has only strengthened Kyiv's determination. Since the summer of 2025, Ukrainian forces have intensified deep strike operations into Russian territory, targeting oil refineries, ammunition depots, and military infrastructure. A senior Ukrainian military leader stated bluntly, after the failed peace talks, that if we continue these attacks, Putin will not be able to sustain this war. This confidence is vastly different from the early months of the conflict, when Ukraine relied almost entirely on Western weapons and intelligence. Now, with domestically produced drones, long-range strike capability, and hardened battlefield experience, Ukraine believes it can impose real costs on Russia regardless of diplomatic shifts in Washington. The ripple effects extend beyond Europe. The tense environment created by the failed peace push has intersected with Asia's own security dynamics. In Japan, Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's recent statement that a Taiwan conflict could justify invoking Japan's collective self-defense provisions triggered an unusually hostile reaction from Beijing. China responded by denouncing Tokyo's position and increasing pressure in regional diplomacy. In this climate, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi and Russia's Security Chief Sergei Shoigu held a high-profile meeting, agreeing that China and Russia would work together in response to Japan's stance. This joint declaration marks more than symbolic coordination. It signals that the Ukraine war and tensions in East Asia are no longer isolated theaters but interconnected fronts of a broader strategic alignment. For Japan, this development is deeply concerning. A more tightly coordinated Beijing-Moscow axis means Tokyo must monitor not only the Taiwan Strait but also the possibility that China and Russia may synchronize diplomatic or military pressure in ways designed to stretch U.S. and Japanese resources thin. From a wider perspective, this alliance confirms that the world is entering a phase where authoritarian powers openly reinforce each other's strategic objectives, whether in Europe or the Indo-Pacific. As 2026 approaches, the sense of global instability is unmistakable. The Ukraine war shows no sign of ending. European relations are under stress unseen since the Iraq War. Russia is actively probing European defenses, while Europe rebuilds its military institutions at a speed not witnessed since the Cold War. China and Russia are aligning more visibly, responding not just to immediate crises but to a shared perception that their influence can grow as Western unity frays. In this environment, Trump's failed peace mediation was not just a diplomatic misstep. It was a moment that revealed a deeper geopolitical realignment, a shift toward a more fragmented, multipolar world where wars drag on because the major powers backing them have fundamentally different stakes, goals, and timelines. The hard truth is that the war in Ukraine may not simply continue. It may evolve into the opening chapter of a broader global contest. And unless the world recognizes that Putin's ambitions stretch far beyond Ukraine, and that the US, Europe, and Asia face interconnected threats, the coming years may be defined not by diplomacy, but by a dangerous new race to prepare for conflicts that are already unfolding in the shadows.